A lot of people have often thought the American Revolution was won because Americans had guerrilla tactics that the British didn't know about. The British knew about the guerrilla tactics. And they sometimes implemented them, although they were not as successful as the Americans at it. But that's not why America won the American Revolution. Some people have thought, well, Americans were better shots, or they had better guns. Nope, that's not why America won the American Revolution. And there's not some special American grit that allowed them to be better fighters than the British. In fact, they were often worse fighters than the British soldiers. America won because of two reasons. Britain made a lot of mistakes, and France became an American ally, and along with France was Spain, and Spain was in May 1775, right after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress met and it had to decide what to do. By July of 1775, they had issued the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. This basically was a pamphlet that states that the colonists had been forced to choose between, quote, an unconditional submission to the tyranny of irritated ministers or resistance by force, and that we mean not to dissolve the Union which has so long and so happily existed between us and which we sincerely wish to see restored. So in May 1775, July 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the American colonies were not trying for independence. But at the same time, they appointed George Washington as commander of the troops and gave him the start of an army. Now, George II, the king, refused to receive the American petitioners for peace and their excuses. And on August 23rd, he declared the colonies to be in a state of open rebellion, and he called on all civil and military officials, as well as a loyal subject, to assist in suppressing what he called the uprising. So here we have the beginning of the American Revolution, where the Americans are saying they were forced to use violence, but they were not trying for independence, and the king absolutely refusing to take any excuses for the violence. Now, the revolution itself, right, if you're not going for independence, it's a very tricky proposition. What is the hope of the American Revolution in 1775, right? It's a colonial revolution against a European mother country, right? There's the risk, right, that you're going against the incredibly powerful England, right? Can you achieve that if that's the hope, right? Second, can you have all 13 colonies united, right? Not likely. They're all very, very different. And third, at the end of this, do you hope to create a new governmental and social order, a true republic with no king, no aristocrats? Do you want elected people? Do you want a broad electorate? This is all pushing Americans to accept the idea of equality, that all men are virtuous citizens, all required to be part of the new nation. Of course, most Americans balked at this level of equality. They didn't want that, right? They didn't want equality between men and women, between whites, Native Americans, and African Americans. So that they put limits on this idea of equality. Now, to get from that first Continental Congress, the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, to the point of independence just a year later, it took a great leap, right? It took a great leap of reimagining what is the purpose of the revolution. Originally, the purpose of the revolution was just to remove some of the limitations on trade that Britain seemed to be imposing, and the soldiers, and some of the sort of limitations on liberty. By 1776, Americans had accepted the revolution as a war for independence, for unity, for a new broad democratic government. And what pushed them to that was this man and his pamphlet. This is Thomas Paine, and this is the pamphlet Common Sense. This pamphlet is sort of a catalyst for many Americans to turn to what we call Whig Republicanism and agreeing to overthrow the king. That was published in January 1776. Thomas Paine had moved to the colonies in 1774 at the age of 34 because he resented English's class structure. And in this pamphlet, in Common Sense, he uses very plain language. It may not seem it to you and me, but for the 18th century, this is very plain language. He uses a lot of biblical references, which everyone would have known, and he uses the ideas of the Enlightenment to argue for independence, right? And this is sort of one of the quotes says, "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind," right? He's using direct assertions to give the revolution greater, bigger meanings. And it's a huge sensation. He just happens to be the right person with the right words at the right time. It's a bestseller. It's probably the first great bestseller, selling 150,000 copies, which means that it was read by the majority of the population, right? Almost everybody read this pamphlet or heard it read. And it becomes so popular that there's enough of a movement that people start putting pressure on their local committees of correspondence, on their local representatives that are going to go to the Second Continental Congress, that say, hey, we want this. We want to encourage this. We want this to be in our future. So here we have an image of the signing of the Declaration of Independence at the Second Continental Congress in 1776. And this is a painting painted by a man named John Trumbull in 1817. So much, much later. So 40 years after this moment, Americans are emphasizing the importance of this event, right? So even a generation later, they're like, okay, what was it that was important? And here you see some of the major men, right? You have Thomas Jefferson, you have John Adams, you have John Hanson, which you don't have to worry about. But the rest of the people, they're sort of, the uniform, right? They're all the same height. They have similar clothing. They have similar, they're all wearing wigs. Right? There's sort of uniformity of people in the Congress. So they're emphasizing the sort of unity and uniformity. They're also emphasizing, and there's Benjamin Franklin up as well. They're also emphasizing the sort of symbols of power, right? The flags, the trumpet, the sort of stately room, right? These are sort of symbols of power. So they're also emphasizing that and the sort of whiteness of the audience. Now, the Declaration of Independence is a very unusual document. And here we see a copy of it. And you see that the biggest signature, right, the John Hancock, which is why people of an older generation often say, put down your John Hancock when they mean signature. The Declaration of Independence is a bill of indictment against the king, right? It's saying, hey, king, you've done all of these crimes against your loyal subjects, so therefore we are going to stop believing in the king. We don't need you. And it sort of symbolically kills the king, right? It sort of sever ties with the empire rhetorically. And so the month after the Declaration of Independence, you start to see people destroying symbols of the king. So I said before the Boston Massacre was on King Street. That becomes State Street. Statues of the king are torn down. Any sort of symbols of the king are destroyed. And so what you have is a real push against the king. Before it was Parliament, and now it's the king as a symbol of that they're going to destroy. So now you sort of used your words to have independence. Now you have to have a war to make that independence reality. Now, American victory is not very likely, right? The British have a powerful navy. They have an industrial machine. That means they have guns, sails, boats. They have a large disciplined army, and they have a treasure. So even though they're in debt, they have money to hire Hessians, outside soldiers. Now, the Americans, the patriots, they have the home turf. They have smugglers. They have an ideological commitment, right? They have a reason for fighting, and they have a pretty good militia, right? Which is good for patrolling against loyalists, people who are American but favor the king, right? War is likely to fail for Americans. So why did they win? Well, as I said before, they won because the British made a lot of mistakes. There are sort of three kinds of mistakes that they made. You have to remember in this war that this is war not between Britain and America, but between Britain and the loyalists and American colonists, right? So that there are a lot of colonists in America who favor Britain, who want to stay loyal to Britain, and they're called loyalists, and those that favor independence are called patriots. And those two populations, they're each about a third, not quite, but each about a third of the American population. And then there's another third that just don't know. So we have 2/3 of the people are not patriots in America. Okay, so having thought of that, the British make three kinds of mistakes. They make tactical mistakes on the battlefield. They make strategic mistakes, looking at sort of the big picture. And the Americans get critical foreign assistance, which the British don't stop. Right? So the British had the opportunity to stop the French aiding, and they don't. Right? So the tactical mistakes. The British are pretty arrogant, right? They had won in the past, like the French and Indian War. The Americans didn't contribute much, and so they didn't think that the Americans had much, right? So they overthink their own power and the Americans' ability to fight. So this is the first problem that they have. And we see that at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which happens in Charleston, in Boston, in 1775. This is an older map of the area, and I'll sort of give you sort of a more easily understood map in a second. You can see Bunker Hill at the top and then Breed's Hill. Most of the battle actually took place on Breed's Hill, but it's been misnamed Bunker Hill, Battle of Bunker Hill since. And here we have the Battle of Bunker Hill in a sort of more understandable manner. So the British hold Boston. Remember that there was a lot of British soldiers in Boston. They went to go attack Lexington and Concord, and then they retreated back to Boston. Now most patriots that were in Boston fled, and then Boston is surrounded basically by a barricade of American Minutemen on the ground, and then you have boats of British Navy on the water. And Boston at this time is very different. You can see that there's a lot more water. Much later, they took the hills. There used to be 7 hills, and they took out the hills and they filled in the water. So you can see where Charles River is now, and the rest of the blue is the land filled in. But in 1775, this is what Boston looked like. Now, the British want to hold Boston, and so they have lots of warships with cannons, but they don't occupy the hills. The Bostonians have the hills, and so they go occupy the hills at night, and so they have the high position. The British could have cut off the peninsula and just not allowed, you can see that there are some small areas of land at the top of the map, right, where the Americans get people into Breed's Hill. The British could have just cut off the Americans at that point, but they don't. Instead, they decide to have frontal attack on Breed's Hill from the water. Right? So they're going uphill from the water rather than attacking from behind. And you can see the British movements in red here. They have 2,200 men attack the Americans' position. They lose half of them. Right? Technically, the British win because the Americans run away. But the Americans see this as a victory because they've survived and they inflicted so many casualties. And this battle is meant to demoralize the Americans, but the Americans are actually encouraged, right? One of the mistakes they made is they did a frontal assault on entrenched Americans. Bad mistake. Here we have a map of all of the battles in the American Revolution, and there's quite a lot. But I just want to emphasize a couple strategic mistakes that the British made in these battles. One of the biggest strategic mistakes is that they tended to fight a battle, leave the Americans with a few people, and then leave the final blow to the next day. That is, that they often took a break at the end of a battle and they retreated and then didn't pursue the Americans. They would let the Americans sort of go away, escape. So they tended to give George Washington and his army the time to escape and retreat, and this happened at the Battle of Long Island and the Battle of New York. So the British under General Howe constantly beat and outmaneuvered George Washington, but then let him escape. So that's one of the strategic mistakes, is they constantly let George Washington escape. They could have stopped him at some point and just ended the war, but they don't. They tend to just give him some leniency because they're like, oh, well, the colonists are like our brothers. They really are British. We don't want to completely destroy them. So they constantly let George Washington's army escape. So that's one of their strategic mistakes. Another one is that the British can keep capturing major cities. They capture Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, and they keep winning and occupying cities, but the Americans still hang on without surrendering, right? So they're using this strategy of maneuvering and capture and taking over cities when they really should be eliminating the Patriots and forcing sort of unconditional surrender. But they don't. They sort of want to take over and control and sort of convince the Americans that they are good leaders, that they really should stay being British rather than destroying them. So that's the second one. And the British commanders never really understand this. Now, George Washington wants a trained army, but he doesn't. He has militiamen, right? These are regular people, artisans, farmers. And this is a French portrayal of these soldiers in 1781. You have a black private in a Rhode Island regiment. You have a white private in infantry. You have a rifleman, and you have an artilleryman. They're definitely not well trained or well organized. They have very few guns, especially good guns. And generally, when they're faced with the British, they run away. So they do. And they get better training, especially starting in the late 1778, 1779. They get better training, but they're not as good as the British. And so they have some lucky escapes, and they have some good battles where they get the upper hand. But for the most part, if you put a Britishman against an American, it's not going to go in favor of the Americans. So what's the reason that the Americans won? Well, one of the major reasons is because of a French alliance. Right? The French don't like the Americans that much. Right? The Americans are anti-king, and they have a king. But the Americans are against the British king, and the French really don't like the British. So they sort of helped them on the side for a long time. They helped them supply guns, cannons, gunpowder, sort of through middlemen, up until about 1777. In 1777, there is a major battle in Saratoga, New York. And the British go to Saratoga to sort of divide the Continental Army and sort of divide and conquer. And they win a small victory. But when they attack again 2 weeks later, the Americans capture some British forces, force the British to retreat. The Americans surround them, and the British are forced to surrender. And this battle, the Battle of Saratoga, gets the French attention. So in 1778, French and America have an alliance, and it's organized by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. And France brings in Spain as an ally to themselves, not to America. So Spain refuses to ally with America, but they do want to bring down Britain. Right? So they're a common British enemy. So now Britain has to worry about fighting in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, where the French and the Spanish are. So this really spreads the British very thin, while also giving some supplies to the Americans. And that is a very important alliance. On a side note, Benedict Arnold was one of the major heroes of the Battle of Saratoga, and he almost was killed. If he had been killed in 1777, he would have died a hero. This is not a very good image, but this is meant to be an image of the Battle of Yorktown. So there are several other battles that I can't go into, but in 1781, all of the battles up to this point sort of finally pay off. Most of the British army is in New York City. with a few in Yorktown, right? They're sort of ordered to trench in, to sort of settle in for a while. Now, George Washington, who's outside of New York City, decides that he's going to pretend to attack New York City with all the British there, but is actually going to trap the British troops in Virginia at Yorktown. At the same time, the French are going to send a navy and block the British from escaping by sea. And you can see those French ships going to block in the British. Right? So you have to coordinate with the French who are in the Caribbean. And so George Washington does this on a gamble, right? He estimates it's got a 10% chance of working up. The French fleet does show up. They defeat the British Navy. The French block the British escape by sea. The Americans attack, and they completely blockade the British at the fort at Yorktown, and the Americans win. Right? So the British even though the British still have a lot of troops in America, and this battle is a loss psychologically, right? And we often think about it as, how could this major empire lose to this backward colonial country, right? How could they lose, right? The British are so sick of casualties, of taxes, of debts, and it's just getting worse, right? It's clear at this point that they're not going to win. So it's not that this battle was such a big victory, but it sort of was that that final blow to the British population that said, that's enough, that's it, we're done. And as the British surrender, they play the song, "The World Turned Upside Down," because it seems to them that the world has been turned upside down, that the small provincial country has overthrown the greatest empire that the world had seen. A good comparison is the American loss in Vietnam, right? When it was realizing that this war was the Vietnam War was never going to be won. There was a sort of sense among the American population, how is that possible? How is it that this major American empire lost to Vietnam, right? To people who don't have the technology or the manpower. There was that sort of shock and loss in the American Revolution. The war officially ends in 1783 with the Second Treaty of Paris. So the war continues for another 2 years, but at this point they're sort of finishing up things, getting troops out, leaving, trying to escape before the treaty is signed. And it's put together by Benjamin Franklin, who's a very cunning diplomat, and it gets America a very good deal. So Britain recognizes America's independence, and it gives them generous boundaries to the Mississippi River, to Florida, to the Great Lakes. And it basically betrays the Native Americans, right? It gives away Native American land. It says, okay, all this land that we had kept for Native Americans, we're giving it to the Americans. So the big losers in the Second Treaty of Paris are the Loyalists, who mostly flee America, go to Canada, go back to Britain. Many African Americans end up going to Liberia. They're fleeing because a lot of African Americans were Loyalists. They flee, and so they're some of the big losers, and Native Americans are very much big losers in this Second Treaty of Paris.